All right, now we are going to move into hazardous materials. And with us today, we have Shawn Rapp, and he is the Senior Hazardous Materials, also known as HazMat, Geologist. So welcome, Shawn.
Thanks. Morning. Let's head right in with the introduction. Name is Shawn Rapp. I'm a registered geologist. That's my official title, Senior HazMat Geologist, the program level. I'm in the new geotech, geology, I think the acronym is GEG, which is kind of funny. And Stu's my new manager as of 2 weeks ago, so we'll see how that goes. I've been with ODOT for a little over 4 years at the program level. Done a lot of work with not only construction, looking at specs, maintenance. I've done complex projects where things get kind of dicey from a regulatory standpoint, which I'll get into a little bit more later. Cleanups, deal with waste management questions, contaminated properties. That was that contaminated soil groundwater bit that Stu mentioned. And deal with a lot of agencies, interagency stuff for either, we've got a facility in the lawn field area that's on or adjacent to a Superfund site, so there's interaction with EPA. We do a lot of DOJ work for liability questions and things like that. Department of Agriculture. It's all across the board. Before that, usually when you hear HazMat and ODOT, people get a little worried that things are going to get kind of squirrely and expensive. Before that, I was at DEQ. I would say at DEQ, being a project manager within the cleanup section, that made people worry a little more about how much things were going to cost. So things have improved for me quite a bit since I've been at ODOT. And then before that was consulting for about 9 years, doing mostly environmental project management from contaminated properties, dry cleaners, landfill assessments, and even did a bit of geotech and materials testing. So what I'm going to talk about in very kind of broad strokes is what is HazMat, how it affects project delivery, where I see hang-ups. I'm going to sort of relate deliverables and things to standard specs and specials, which we have several of. Going to talk a little bit about state and federal rules and guidance. I think when it gets to HazMat, we're talking about contaminated properties. It can get a little complicated with all the different agencies from EPA to DEQ and some of the hoops that need to be jumped through. Going to talk about hazardous substances, so surveys, so lead-based paint, asbestos, those kinds of simple things. Corridor surveys that deal with right-of-ways and easements. Those can be larger projects, more complex. That's when you're starting to talk about tanks and intersections and more contamination. And then talk a little bit about what's coming. Since I've been here, we've done quite a bit looking at shoulder soil management. It's been a big issue since about 2014. There's some reorganization in the geology section. It's not going to affect the regions as much as me, but there's some things with QC process development. We've got an updated program manual that's coming out. And then if I have time, I'm going to go through one kind of case study that sort of gels how communication and decisions can affect a project out in Tillamook. So what is HazMat? It can be any combination of these things. We're talking about underground storage tanks, heating oil, waste oil, gasoline, diesel. Right at every intersection in every small town, there was a gas station or 2 or 3 and a dry cleaner, and that can impact the subsurface quite a bit. Contaminated media, that's the contaminated soil, groundwater. I've looked at projects in Portland that dealt with contaminated sediment that were in Portland Harbor, where we were doing some bridge work. Asbestos, lead-based paint, and we get into solid versus hazardous wastes. Fueling and oils, spills on construction projects. And so these which one's the pointer? Anyway, Okay. Standard specifications, that's sort of where I live in the standards, and then the specials. For each of those issues, we've got several special provisions that need to be included on each project depending on, and those are going to change depending on what's found, how much is there. So place and project development. This is a draft. I'm going to be talking a little bit more. We've got a draft QC manual that's sort of modeled after the chapter 23 in the GDM. Not quite as complicated, but the majority of the projects, the majority of the major deliverables, let me say, need to occur at or before DAP. You'll see some of those projects or deliverables in preliminary, advanced, and final plans. This isn't necessarily something that you need to read, but just to let you know that we can have a pretty large footprint. Usually, I would say 80% of what we do is in the scoping through DAP phases, and any of the follow-ups, addendums are going to be in preliminary and advanced plans. So where is our place in project development on that project development cycle? It's pretty much on that section of the track. It can be anywhere from scoping through DAP is where the majority of your HazMat work needs to be done. As Stu mentioned, there are a lot of unknowns when you're dealing with subsurface and when you're dealing with contamination. Where it came from, where it is now, and where it's going to can make that, can be equally, if not more complex. Because gasoline's going to travel in different directions and a different rate than, say, a dry cleaner solvent. So the earlier in the process, and a lot of the stuff on basic sort of bread and butter projects, having your HazMat coordinator, regional HazMat coordinator in the scoping meeting, a lot of projects can potentially be screened out. You know, there's not going to be an issue. We're only dealing with say, an on-ramp or an off-ramp. It's adjacent to a property that's a suspected source of contamination, but we're not going to encounter anything because we're just far enough away. Whereas that same project, if you're doing, say, deep sign foundations or something with a retaining wall and you're getting into groundwater, then the footprint of your HazMat issue may get a little bigger. So rules and guidance, federal rules, this is sort of, I'm going to say just a summary of the major highlights of things that we need to consider in the HazMat program for projects. There's RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, that deals with hazardous waste. There's a section in standard specs that covers waste determinations and going through that process. The Clean Water Act deals with associated spills and petroleum rules, so that's going to affect not only old spills that, say, aren't ODOT's responsibility, but that's going to creep into pollution prevention or pollution control plans that are in your, that go along with every project, especially if you're adjacent to any waterway, stormwater system, those sorts of things. And then we've got OSHA, Occupational Health and Safety Administration. They have a special section in their rules called, it's abbreviated HazWOPR, but it's the Hazardous Waste and Emergency Response section, and that covers the requirements and certifications for any project professional that is going to be working on a contaminated facility, what they need to do. It includes medical screenings because we're starting to talk about chemical exposures and things like that. For Oregon rules, we've got solid waste rules, which deal with not only trash, but as we're going to talk about, contaminated media, a lot of it. RCRA in Oregon is administered by the state, so luckily we only have one agency to deal with in terms of waste management. We've got cleanup rules that deal with groundwater, contaminated soil, asbestos rules, that's in DEQ's AIR program, so even though in our case we're going to be dealing with things like transite pipes or asbestos in bridges, that's in the AIR program. And then we've got spill rules, which deal with emergency response issues on construction projects. HazMat, aside from dealing with maintenance and construction, we also deal with things like tanker crashes on sides of highways. So we get exposed to a lot of that. But a lot of those rules also apply to construction projects and facilities in terms of pollution prevention. And then we've got guidance. There's a difference between the ASTM standards and AASHTO where it comes to site assessments and corridor surveys. There's different levels of investigation that need to happen, and a lot of that deals with liability, ODOT's acceptance of some liability. AASHTO is a lower standard than the ASTM, but sometimes the ASTM standard is required. And then we've got a whole slew of DEQ guidance dealing with clean fill, a lot of fact sheets, waste management, are chunks of asphalt, clean fill that can be used as a fill at a project versus asphalt grindings. There's a distinction there. So we deal with all kinds of DEQ guidance as well. So we're going to talk about just sort of simple one-off hazardous substances and surveys for those. So asbestos is a common one, especially in bridges, but it also comes up in transite pipe, which is what's on the left, expansion joints on bridges, and then less frequently, you're going to get into things like asbestos insulation. So that's that kind of friable asbestos that people talk about as insulation in schools, either in ceilings or pipe, or asbestos is in all kinds of different building materials, or at least was, floor tiles, and that can impact projects from improper disposal in the past. Hazardous servants, so moving on to lead paint, that's special provision 296. This one is probably one of the more frequent special provisions. It deals with, we've got a legacy, and as all transportation departments have, of using paint. Really good paint used to have lead in it, but that's caused a problem in terms of when it sloughs off, like in the photo on the left, gets into soil, that causes a problem. And then things like striping, where that photo on the right was stripe grindings that was not managed properly on an ODOT project, and that color is going to get the attention, and did in that case, of a DQ hazardous waste inspector, and caused some problems. But we're talking about lead, cadmium, and chromium are the three big ones, but also covered in that is painted metal, concrete, wood. A lot of that stuff can be given to the contractor with a signing of a acceptance form, that they're acknowledging that this might have lead coatings on it. And especially in that case of the paint stripings, a lot of times it's a hazardous waste. So it needs special handling, not just kind of put on the ground. Less common, but still can impact a project. PCBs and mercury, so we're talking about things like electrical transformers. There shouldn't be any PCB oils in any of those anymore, but you can still have residuals that sort of trigger special waste management issues. Mercury switches aren't terribly common in large quantities, but what we do come across is light bulbs, and usually that special provision will just say, give all the mercury-containing light bulbs back to the electricians for recycling. This is where it gets a little bit more complicated. Corridor assessments and easements. For larger corridor projects, where you're dealing with property acquisitions, you can encounter things like underground storage tanks, UICs, or which used to be called dry wells, underground injection control devices. That's one of those stormwater control facilities. Stormwater has a lot of runoff from roads. You can get oils, metals, all kinds of things, and that needs to be characterized and dealt with. You have septic systems, and then sort of the big one that we're dealing with on every project is contaminated media. And like I said before, that can be soil, groundwater, or in rare occasions, even sediment. Environmental site assessments. These are sort of the two big ones that everybody is more familiar with. Phase ones being that first tier. It's maybe $3,000 to $5,000, and we're talking about a couple months to do. It's looking at historical site uses, properties. That photo or that map on the right is something called a Sanborn fire insurance map. Back starting in the late 1800s, fire companies went through and surveyed all properties to find out what was explosive or flammable. It identified any tanks, and that's sort of one of the types of historical information that gets researched to figure out, it's a screening tool. Is a property that's adjacent to a project going to be a problem, or isn't it? If it's found that there may be a problem there, we're moving on to phase 2, environmental site assessment, which we're talking about doing drilling, soil sampling, groundwater sampling. We may be looking at building materials, either in a building or in a demoed building that had been bulldozed over. We're looking at paints. So when you get into phase 2 ESAs and some of these corridor surveys, you're combining some of those hazardous substance surveys in with subsurface exploration. And part of that phase 2 sampling, we're looking at sources. What are the sources? Who are the responsible parties? We can start talking about potential volumes, cost implications for a project, for management. How deep is a project going to impact? How much soil is that going to generate? How does that soil need to be managed and disposed? And then their memos or reports for either of those. The next phase for that would be classically the phase 3, which would be the cleanup. Now, we're not responsible as the department for doing cleanups, but we are the ones generating the waste since we're doing the work and excavating the material. So we need to deal with the disposal. If that gets really expensive, we start talking about cost recovery, liability. Whose is it? Is the responsible person? Do they need to cover our costs for disposal? That sort of thing. Contaminated media, this is probably the biggest risk factor in terms of cost impacts to any projects, because there are a lot of unknowns when you start talking about contamination in the subsurface. Complex would be, I would consider, former or current service stations, industrial sites, chemical manufacturers, concrete plants, that sort of thing. Former dry cleaners. There's fewer of those every day, but they're still out there. UICs and groundwater and sediments. Most of those are complex because in at least a good portion of the state where most of these facilities are and most of the projects are, there's a higher chance for those to impact groundwater. And once groundwater is impacted, things can get kind of complicated really quickly. Simple, and that's in quotes, is shoulder soil. We have statewide issues. I'm going to be talking about that briefly a little bit later, but that's a little more straightforward process because we're talking about shallow soils. And then projects that impact residential properties, there's a limited set of environmental concerns that come with residential properties, mostly lead-based paint and maybe heating oil, that sort of thing. So what's coming in shoulder soil management? This is the sort of a basic model of runoff contamination that may contain contaminants from asphalt or concrete, where it goes, how far it goes, and that's sort of the picture I want to have in your mind when we talk about some of this next stuff. So DEQ solid waste rules and their clean fill internal management directive was put out in 2014, sort of sets the framework on what is or is not considered, quote, clean fill, and the process for evaluating it. Our tie into that is 29022, and this is a quote: clean fill per the OARs is the property of the contractor and requires a clean fill determination, okay? For a long time, we didn't really worry much about that because we figured, well, this is just surface soil, it's not near anything, it's a non-issue. And some projects in Region 1 showed us that that's not necessarily easy to determine in about 2012, 2013. And so what led to that was the ODOT Directive G1401, and that's probably been a bit of heartburn for a lot of projects all across the state, because it established a new ODOT policy on soil management in the operational right-of-way. to 1.5 feet deep. And basically it put an end to making fill material the property of the contractor at the point of generation without doing this clean fill determination. Because if it's not clean fill in accordance with solid waste rules, it's a regulated waste. If it's a regulated waste, we can't be giving it to people because that's improper disposal. So that's a violation of state rule potentially. So in 2014, that established that, and that sort of put regions in a tizzy. My predecessor, Jenny Armstrong, which some of you may know, started a statewide evaluation looking at sort of that picture, that model, how do contaminants impact shoulder soils, and then start looking at ODOT projects that had sample data, and then started looking at collecting additional soil samples across the state. So that was done in 2015, and then I came on board in 2015, and long and short of it is to try to establish trends of metals concentrations, let's say, across the state. It requires a lot of data to be able to figure out where you are when you start controlling for things like ADT, distances, depths, what metals you're looking at. It gets really complicated quickly, and you need a lot of data to make any kinds of conclusions. So we did another study in 2017, and that led us to what's called a beneficial use determination through DEQ. It was something they hadn't done before. I'm not sure any other state's done it before, but it's a statewide sort of permit. We can think of it as a permit that allows for reuse of some of those materials, which we've done in the past, that don't meet clean fill standards, but don't need any kind of special handling, where we can identify some sort of pre-approved, maybe 5, 6, 7, depending on what region you're in, what part of the state you're in. We can reuse those under the authority of the beneficial use determination. I may say BUD, that's the shorthand for it, without having to go to DEQ and get approval or some variance or waiver every single time, because that's kind of where we were at 2014. So there have been some implementation challenges. We're working through those. The permit, the BUD, has been approved. We're working on implementation challenges. That's dealing with, we've got to draft a specification, a special provision to deal with this. We're working through a manual revision that's going to sort of walk HazMat coordinators sort of through the process, things to consider. We're going to revise the GE 1401 to reflect some of the new changes. So we're in a process right now of doing that now that the BUD is finalized. What's coming in 2020, we've got that geology geotech section. There's probably going to be some changes that work their way into regions and trying to figure out how regions versus program QC processes are going to work. That's not exactly necessarily clear to me yet, but that's going to get worked through. We're revising the HazMat program manual. That's being done now. It's a full update to all sections. We've got a new section on shoulder soils, clean fill evaluations, how to interpret the BUD, how it changes or what the differences are between regions. And I mentioned the QC process. It's going to talk a little bit more about each of the major deliverables. And then mostly it's the responsibilities of the PORs. We've got a very small program, and so there's going to need to be some regional sort of sharing in deliverables reviews. So case study, this was in Region 2 in Tillamook. I may have to check my notes on this one. I think this went to construction about a year or two ago. This project's, I believe, at the intersection of 101 and 6, right in downtown Tillamook. During scoping and project development, there was identified a lot of tanks were known to be in the area. There were a couple of active filling station, gas station cleanup sites that were undergoing DEQ oversight. And it was one of those spots where, groundwater's shallow, you've got very porous or permeable soils out there, and you've got gas stations on opposite corners, and you've got merged plumes, which makes it even more complicated because there's lawyers all over this thing. And so this went to construction, and there were multiple tanks. Like I said, we came across several of those in the realignment and the widening, some odd ones that usually they're not set vertically, but over the years, people would just put in tanks, and whatever they wanted to put in it, a lot of times was okay, whether it was fuel, whether it was waste oil, whether that was some waste solvent from a service station. So I guess the lessons learned, the tanks were identified during a phase 1 or corridor survey. There were areas of known shallow groundwater impacts. Obviously, we had multiple cleanups, DEQ cleanup sites. They were dealing with that with commingled plumes that drug everything on, so cleanups didn't get completed. The HazMat coordinator and the RECP recommended that groundwater management be included in that contaminated media special provision 294. It went to an A&E consultant. They just decided that they were going to stage the project during low groundwater, which can be a little bit unpredictable in Tillamook. And so that was the lowest bid, right? And so in Tillamook, when you're talking about tanks that were installed in the 40s and 50s, they're in sand, and groundwater touches the bottom of them. They rust, you get holes in them, you get these plumes. That's where they came from. The end result was, well, they did do it in what they assumed. They did construction in a time when they assumed there would be low groundwater. Turns out there wasn't. So we had about a $2 million change order come through because 650,000 gallons of gas and diesel contaminated groundwater needed to be pumped continuously so that you could finish the project, so you can keep your trenches dry. And then you've got to treat and dispose of that, right? So that was $2 million. So this is one of those kinds of things where early on in the project, we had the problems identified, but it was decided as it went to bid, well, we're going to do this a little bit differently. We can't tell people how to stage projects and those sorts of things, and that can be, this is admittedly a pretty worst case result. So it's that balance for HazMat of risk versus reward, spending the time and money on the front end with the hope that nothing major or unmanageable is found. Region 4 had a project that purchased a property in Terrebonne. Somebody way back when had demoed a building. There's asbestos tile all through the soil. Once you break that up and churn it up, not only is the tile now asbestos waste, but all the soil it's mixed with is asbestos waste. When you're making those kind of property purchase decisions, where's the funding for that come from? It would have been cost prohibitive to dispose of that appropriately because it all has to be double bagged or double lined at least in a dump truck. But basically it was landfilled on the property. That was the cheapest thing that we could do, but now we've got this legacy problem on this project that is going to be with us, right? Right of way is an issue. Are we buying properties, fee simple, or there are easements? There are liability issues associated with that. So that one thing to take away, anytime we're in the subsurface, as Stu said, but even more so with contamination, predictability, I would say, is directly proportional to investigation. You want more predictability, you're going to want more subsurface sampling, but it can never be 100%. This might be the most important slide I show today. These are your regional HazMat coordinators and their phone numbers. As Stu said, if somebody calls for the question, my first response is if you talk to these people, these guys know the regions like the back of their hand. They know where the problems are. They know where, yeah, and I'll just leave it at that. Final thoughts on project HazMat development. I surveyed we have two PG2s in the program, Bart Brotherton from Region 2. Those are their two parting thoughts. Never think a project is too simple for a HazMat issue. And then Charlie Schwartz in Region 1, engage HazMat early, as early as possible. And then I guess I have a third one, and this is something that's come up relatively recently with the House Bill 2017 projects. I would say this early engagement is even more vital. A project came through. Basically, a HazMat coordinator couldn't deal with it. They made recommendations on needed to be contracted out. Let me see their scope of work, make sure they're doing things correctly. None of that stuff got done, and three months before the project went to bid, they got a consultant engineering contractor on board to try to do the specifications, and they tried to do all that investigation work that was supposed to happen early on in scoping. They tried to do it at bid as part of the bid package, and that didn't go through Dan Anderson, and we had to work with them to. They basically had to send all of that shoulder material to landfill because it hadn't been sampled yet. And luckily it wasn't a lot of soil that needed to be disposed of then, but on a project, if that were to happen, say on I-26, on 26 in Beaverton, there were 50,000 cubic yards of soil that needed to be managed. And that entire project needed to be re-engineered because it was all placed on the project. So that was one where they had to go through a major redesign. So the earlier that can happen, the better. So that's it. Questions?
We have time for one question from you, Franny.
Apologies.
And that's it. But we need it for the sound.
When contamination is legacy, like that $2 million cost overrun on Tillamook, is cost recovery happening on that, or does transportation dollars have to pay for all that?
In that case, I don't know if that instance has been resolved yet because of the extremely high cost, but whenever you're talking about liability, and in that case especially, you've got two commingled plumes, so you've already got two sites that are pretty heavily lawyered up, and it's always, and this is a problem for HazMat, it's always a problem with, where's the level do you take cost recovery to, and how much is it worth to get back based on impacts of project schedule and things? Is $50,000 worth enough? Is $50,000 of cost enough to engage DOJ? Is that $100,000? Is it $2 million? When you know that you're going to have a prolonged battle, those are the sorts of things that you got to consider. But ODOT, I would say, this is my personal opinion, excuse me, we pay for it more than we should, right? Because I don't know if we've gone through that or not. I know we've talked to DOJ about it, whether or not that's moved forward. Bernie, do you know? No? Nope. Sorry. So I don't know, to be honest, for that project.
Thank you, Shawn, so much. Let's give a round of applause to
Thanks.
Shawn Rapp.